Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Today, my guest is Lou Florez. Lou is a medicine maker, priest, activist, and artist who has studied with indigenous communities and elders throughout the globe. Lou grounds his teachings and practice in the idea that being connected to our physical, emotional, spiritual, and environmental landscapes is a fundamental necessity for any long-lasting change to occur. Lou shares his journey from witnessing assorted spiritual practices in Catholic Church bingo parlors to being a spiritual activist supporting queer people of color in Oakland, California, and beyond. Find out more at louflorez.com. Hi, Lou. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nick, for having me on. I'm excited to be here with everyone today.
Great. So I thought we would start by having you talk about how you became a spirit worker and what it means to you to be a spirit worker.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking me that question. By spirit worker, I'm talking about a form of folk tradition based in Southern folklore, Southern tradition, root work tradition. And what that all boils down to is a series of magics. And what I mean by magics are traditions based upon experience, observations in nature's revelations from spirit within specific cultural context and landscape. As many people know, specifically looking at the history of the South, there's deep-rooted systems of marginalization and institutional oppression that divorce people from access to power, access to agency, access to most needed resources and materials for their lives. And so what happens when you can't turn to the law or you can't turn to anyone outside of you and your relationship with spirit, you start to look at the things around you to create the most poignant change. And so what I mean by spirit work is a system of working and observing and being in communication with spirit and tapping into the inherent nature, the inherent knowledge, both in your landscape that's in your backyard, as well as all the allies and spirit allies and knowledge that comes from your teachers and your kind of upbringing. And so for me, spirit work is a combination of root work and some of the witchcraft traditions and the more of the African traditional religions in terms of Orisha work and that kind of conversation between all those traditions that I hold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you really practice and have studied a lot of different kinds of traditions. And so I can see that there's a big melting pot inside of you in terms of what you bring to your work.
Exactly. And I think that, both in terms of my biology, working with Latin American folk remedies and sometimes using the word folk feels like it denigrates what we're talking about. But what I'm wanting to indicate in terms of that term is much more of a one-on-one relationship with the earth versus a book type of study that we see in terms of the academy. And so, I don't think that there's a word that really signifies that, in terms of our lexicon, outside of root worker or, spirit worker in terms of, those kind of signifiers for people who work with the mystery, if that makes sense. And also that these traditions are learned, firsthand from elder to student versus just from a book. So, there's this idea of the ongoing revelation that spirit didn't just, speak at one point or revealed itself in one way, that there's that constant continual conversation. And so we, work from the roots in terms of the legacies of those who have come before us, but we also, grow the knowledge and form the knowledge and create those types of constellations with the ways in which oppressions are hitting us now. Mm-hmm. And, specifically as a spirit worker, within the context or the lens of, living and working within the South, a lot of the work there is liberatory in terms of, there's a great need. We need something immediately, not 10 years from now. How do we make our lives better with the resources that we have versus, buying the $10,000 crystal or, whatever in terms of outside, power access? How do we inherently use what we have in this moment to create the change that we're looking to create.
What I also hear a little bit in what you're talking about is that there's, when you say it's outside of just being in a book, that it's primarily, I imagine, an oral tradition that's passed down. And, given that it came from, at least parts of this came from people who came from Africa, that either they didn't have the means to write it down or that it wasn't safe to write it down as a way to sort of keep it safe for people.
Well, and also that there's a technology in terms of orality that we, and there's also so much scholarship that's coming in around how the brain functions at the point of solidifying it and concretizing narrative in terms of a written language, and the difference that, kind of the hemispheric difference and chemical difference in the brains whenever, kind of looking at kind of pre-literature, oral traditions versus, like book learning type of things. And there's some interesting things around dementia and Alzheimer's and the ability for the brain to continue functioning in terms of longevity, that sometimes working with the written word outside of just like the concretizing of the narrative, the biomechanics of it all. And then the other part of the kind of oral traditions is the magic in terms of the phrasing, in terms of what the stories do and the repetition to change the consciousness and the mind. Because a lot of especially when you look at like Afro-diasporic traditions, it stems from tonal languages, and there's some really deep mystical roots around tonality and tone and rhythm in terms of helping to change some of the consciousness shifting, that form of metaphysics that, works in hand with the medicinal as well as the magical component. That all of that is part of the story, so to speak. And what I mean by the story, the way that I divine, one of the predominant ways that I divine if you're coming to me just, off the street is through tarot. And the way that I learned tarot was through this kind of spirit work tradition. And so each card holds not only, being able to identify the root issue or the root of it all, but then identifying the spiritual allies, whether it's, specific folk saints or cultural, icons or, spiritual entities that are there for our upliftment, being able to identify the medicinal herbs that could be used to, work with things like, adrenaline, deficiency whenever we're talking about like, ongoing trauma situations, looking at magical remedies in terms of being able to soothe, any volatility as well as create opportunity and solution. So all that's held within the kind of the narrative of the card. And so it's like, how do we access that, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Now, in your website, you talk about how you started on this spiritual path in bingo parlors and a playground. And I'd like for you to tell us a story about how that began in those places of your childhood.
Well, I am from an East Texas town called Kaufman, Texas. It's way out, I'm going to say like 45 minutes southeast of Dallas. And back in the 80s, it was a little farm community. It's now grown quite a bit, but back in the day, it was definitely a, tumbleweed, growing hay. And I actually lived on a chicken farm. And my mom, is Catholic, much more of a folk Catholic. And what I mean by that is, not just going to Sunday school Catholic, being able to kind of, and it's not even amalgamate, but engaging and building relationships with other people of color in terms of what spiritual tidbits, what spiritual tools are you using to get your life ahead, if that makes sense. And for me, that's what root work is. It's a conversation between, different communities at different points in times in different locations, in terms of who had accessibility and, what did people do in those moments whenever they had not. And so, kind of growing up with that mentality, and my mom was a big old bingo, fanatic, and we would go to the Catholic, basement bingo I think it was every Monday. And that was another form of like my recognition of the systems of oppression, the kind of caste system, because you had in one corner of the room, that more owning class Irish grandmothers, in another state of the room, there was the kind of the middle class, mother, father, 4 kids and the dog, type of scenario. In the back of the room were the, people of color, the old grandmothers, the, single mothers, the, working class, type of family dynamic. And so each one had their different, not only different like places to sit, but different ways that they engaged spirit in order to bring favor or luck to them in that moment, all within the Catholic Church. So, with the Irish grandmothers, you had all the, the Irish saints and the four, the lucky clovers, all that kind of, folk dynamic happening, right? Back in the back where I was, we had, everything from the lucky Buddhas, the fat Buddhas with the big belly that you rub, to the, the rabbit's feet, to, little prayer cards to the Virgin of Guadalupe, to, different stones and rosaries or whatever. And I remember, some people having like little troll dolls that they filled with, different items and anointing it with, their little lucky oils, So it was interesting, like looking back at that all within this kind of container of Catholicism in some way, as the priest was literally calling out the numbers to bingo, and you have all these different people engaging their own little spiritual tricks, all within the kind of this larger vessel of, kind of folk Catholicism. And so, I kind of just sitting there and watching it as a little kid, not knowing what was going on, was absolutely hilarious and fun. And then starting to understand that wasn't how everybody else looked at the world, was a totally different conversation. Because I think whenever you grow up in the South, there's so much of that repetition of sign and symbol that's just repeated that becomes quote unquote superstition, but actually has deep rooted context within the kind of revelatory nature of a people, within the narrative of their like spiritual landscape. And how, we kind of as pilgrims, whether it's by choice or by force, we carry these signs, we carry these, these relics with us, in our everyday life,
Yeah, I love hearing that. I can just imagine the little kid you wandering around this sort of church auditorium, taking a tour of all these different areas where you have the different groups of people using their different practices and technologies, and you just kind of taking it all in and absorbing it.
Exactly. And while it might seem segregated, there is always, there's this kind of ongoing conversations within the groups and between the boundaries as well that wasn't, these kind of impermeable, or it was very permeable membranes versus impermeable. But that's almost like the repertoire that you see repeated over and over, within different communities in the South. And then my own personal journey going to the idea of the playground was in kindergarten, and my own kind of self-revelation of spirit in whatever way you want to call it, whether it's God or goddess or, the universe or divine consciousness. But just something as simple as, playing with a red ball and it rolling into a grove of trees. And, I went after it and looked up in the sky. And for that moment, it just felt like the whole world stopped. And you could just feel the air of the divine, that breath of life and spirit in that second. And then it all just dissolved and went away. And I got the ball and ran back to friends. But those moments are my form of communication of spirit, where it just feels like everything's complete and perfect and joyous and limitless.
Yeah, I like that. So you've talked about, growing up in the South and, being among all these different cultures and ethnicities in that area. And I know that now, as an activist, you advocate for dialogues and investigations of the intersectionalities of race, class, and gender within the different pagan spiritual contexts. And I wonder what led you to do this kind of work and why it's important now.
I don't ever think that there was a differentiation between activism and spirit work in terms of the way that I was educated with my elders, as well as just in terms of cultural dialogue for spirit workers in the South. As somebody who has done this professionally for, I think, about 25 years now, which is hecka crazy. Started out real young and put myself through college, reading cards and working, doing mojos and working people. And, what that entails is a whole different things depending on, what situations pop up. So that could look like engaging in different roots, jars, tinctures, hands, different ways of creating sacred objects that carry magic or carry power behind them for people to engage either opportunity or avert, some sort of crisis. And unfortunately, most crisis comes from systems of oppression. I wish that, they didn't, but when we really look at the majority of the ways that we both energetically hold trauma in the body in the physical sense. So what that looks like would be, like I was talking about before, in terms of adrenaline deficiencies and, issues with liver and spinal cords and inflammatory bowel. Like there's some deep-seated root causes in terms of how people of color, queer people of color, working class queer people of color, not only that, but of course with ability and all the other forms of oppressions that these communities are my communities. They're the people who come to me. And so there isn't a differentiation between, fighting for workers' right versus how to help somebody get a job. So it's doing the same thing, in order to fully support my community. I'm out there, fighting for them hand to hand on the street and then also at my altars. And that was very clear in terms of the way that I was brought up, or like my kind of education in the community, or those uniting threads that, I can't just speak about it or pray about it. I actually have to take action in the world around it. So there's a complete package there. And like I said, like all of the things that I'm active in or that I'm passionate about are issues that I'm facing, myself, that are bigger reflections of the community voices that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and how to give them access and resource, and also create networks, within the larger structures to bring in access and agency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, some of the stuff you're just mentioning in terms of working with queer people of color and doing this work with them. You are located in Oakland, California, and, at the time of this recording, there was just recently another murder of a queer woman of color, trans woman, Nia Wilson, and I just happened to come across being at the BART station the other day where it happened and really being moved by what was happening there. And you said that you've been working particularly with a lot of trans people right now, and wondering what other kinds of common issues or challenges you're seeing with queer folks that you're working with in your practice right now.
Absolutely. Well, I think that it depends on the type of queer that we're talking about, because I think that it's really easy to universalize, like that there's, predominant issues. Well, of course, safety absolutely is number one across the board. The way that safety looks or what that means, if we kind of filter that out through, race and class and ability and gender, that all looks very different within those populations. So a lot of what some of my students are having to deal with are communities or, issues around immigrants' rights, around abuse of police authority, around drug and addiction related, systems and ways of getting help that doesn't re-institutionalize or, bring punishment into, people who are already just, barely surviving, issues with incarceration, and both in terms of true justice and the amount of profiling that goes on with, trans women of color and trans men of color, and, the amount of time that innocent people are being, thrown, behind bars without even getting access to, court hearing is beyond ridiculous. The day in, day out calls that I get, just, it illuminates me in a different way in terms of seeing the real trauma of oppression on the body. That's just the things off the top of my head, much less like, more of the, intense, issues with domestic violence, issues with, being, kind of identified in public and the repercussions of that, both in terms of safety and in terms of, accessibility to jobs and employment afterwards. There's a lot of concrete, just harshness that's in the world right now that I don't think people think of whenever they hear about queer issues. How is immigration and incarceration a queer issue?
Mm-hmm.
Much less like of course, thinking of keeping, gay marriage and, things like that. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of most of the hardship that, a lot of my communities are having to deal with right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for a lot of non-queer people that they are not quite understanding that immigration and incarceration are definitely queer issues in terms of the ways that oppression and marginalization is really affecting all of those people. And I'm really glad that you are out there doing this work, supporting those people to get some more resources.
Absolutely. And that are people, and that, one of the biggest things, I think is a kind of a whitewashing of kind of queer voice and even queer spirituality in terms of inviting, trans people of color, non-gender conforming people of color, queer and lesbian, gay and lesbian people of color, to the table in terms of what's actually being prayed for. It's not tangible to my daily life. It's some sort of, buy-in of what my community actually needs and why am I there in circle,
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just saying, I think for me and, going back to my upbringing, I come from very, amazingly brilliant, first and second generation queer, lesbian, spirituality, riches, root workers. And I think that that's kind of that on the grounds looking, on the grounds participating and engaging in, kind of spiritual workings that are about, working with the community needs in the moment is where, what made me come to European, witchcraft, or, made me first, open my eyes there and be like, oh, that's really juicy, and when I kind of, not miss, because I think it's still there, but there's a one-dimensionality in terms of some of the deities and the ways that it gets engaged. For me, it doesn't feel as welcoming or as inviting as I wish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
Oh, my Audre Lorde practice. For 3 years, I was working on Audre Lorde altar as a folk saint who definitely spoke to my queerness in my body, spoke to my access to my body in terms of, a brown man and the ways in which brown men have been conditioned to not feel like our bodies are our own.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in her writings, she gave me permission and investigation to look at the contours of my queerness within my queer maleness, and gave me permission to engage that in a place that wasn't a demonization, but a welcoming home. And so for a year, for 3 years, or for the first year, I created an altar and did a yearly kind of feast to artists and, kind of cultural saints that really spoke to me. The second year, I did a meditation where I took a quote of hers every day and did a little bit of Lectio Divina, kind of holy scripture type of situation where I meditated on the phrase and, wrote into it and created mojos around some of the ideas around how I wanted to be loved and seen and uplifted. And then for the third year, I did gratitude work where I did that work on behalf of community. So that was a really beautiful, from 23, I think, to 26. That was a really phenomenal just kind of practice in terms of queering, kind of queering conjure and queering spirit and queering myself too, in terms of my formations of my own sexuality and sexual orientation.
Great. I love that. So Lou, where can people find more about you and your work and get in touch?
Absolutely. Well, I am extremely excited to be offering a series called the Brujos Toolkit. It's going to be held, I think, maybe in San Francisco. The location's still up to be decided, but it looks like starting mid to late October. And a friend of mine, Napaket Sally, she's going to be co-facilitating with me. And we're going to be it's a series of classes looking at intersectional magical and medicinal workings, specifically tied to people of color, queer people of color, all the ways that we just need advocacy and agency and power and ways of engaging that. So that's going to be a series throughout the fall. And you can find out more about me on my website at Florez, LOUSLOREZ.com.
Great. Well, that sounds really juicy. I look forward to hearing more about that.
Thank you for having me on, and thank you again.
Yeah, thanks for being here. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.